I'm the branch head of the National Earth and Marine Observations branch at Geoscience Australia, and I'm the Australian Geo Principal. In my role, I look after the Digital Earth Australia program, as well as the Marine and Antarctic Geoscience programs. I'm honoured to moderate this session today, and I look forward to engaging with you all. Today, the sessions are aiming to investigate what and how the GEO work program activities what program activities are best positioned to provide input into country efforts to develop ocean and marine conscious climate action, with particular focus on climate adaptation measures. The outcomes and recommendations for the session are important, and we call to the GEO principals to engage governments and to examine the feasibility of the GEO work program activities to develop practical guidance for national adaptation plans on the ocean and marine element. As we all know, COP26 has further highlighted the ocean and climate nexus that strengthens the role of mitigation and adaptation action in this context. The GEO community is ready to contribute to this important action item with practical knowledge products. Today, we'll have 4 presentations by our panel members, followed by a Q&A session. If you have questions during the presentations, please pop them in the chat panel in AirMeet, and we will address as many as we can after completion of all presentations at the Q&A session. I also encourage you to put forward any other questions for the panel members at any time. Our first speaker today is Ambassador Peter Thompson. Ambassador Thompson is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, in which role he drives global support for UN Sustainable Development Goal 14 to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources. He served as President of the UN General Assembly from 2016 to 2017. Unfortunately, Ambassador Thompson has not been able to join us yet, but we do have a video that he has pre-recorded. So over to Ambassador Thompson.
Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to addressing the GEO session on 24th of November. For many years now, I have noted with appreciation how GEO has focused on the use of Earth observations for environmental and societal impact. This is, of course, particularly pertinent in 2021, the year of the UNFCCC's COP26 in Glasgow. When we meet in GEO Week on the 24th of November, we will have a clear view of the outcomes of the Glasgow conference and what these mean for humanity's future. I put it in those terms as you will no doubt have heard that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described the recent findings of the IPCC as a red alert for humanity. Response to this red alert will continue into the first half of next year with the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, being held in Kunming, China in April, and the UN Ocean Conference being held at the end of June in Lisbon, Portugal. Contributing positively to these great gatherings brings a new set of challenges and opportunities to the international Earth observation community. As we approach them, I ask you to consider why ocean science claims a place at the heart of global considerations. The planet's climate is essentially created by interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean. Thus, the ocean must be center stage in addressing climate change. The other great planetary challenge, biodiversity loss, is concerned with the alarming rate of extinction of the planet's life forms. Since the great majority of these life forms are hosted in the ocean, once again, reliable ocean science is critical to correct conclusions. I look forward to hearing the results of your findings on these existential matters during the GEO Week 2021. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks to Ambassador Thompson. Our next presenter is Julian Barbier. Julian is the head of Marine Policy and Regional Coordination Section at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. Since 2017, he's been spearheading the development and coordination of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for dear colleagues from the GEO Secretariat for giving us the opportunity to talk about the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which I'm sure you are all aware started on January 2021. And the decade is really about, building a step change in the way we are generating knowledge and the way we are using knowledge for ocean sustainability. It's about creating partnership. It's about bridging knowledge systems, whether social, physical, indigenous knowledge, and it's really about building the science policy interface so that we can really help the countries of the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 14 that Ambassador Thompson refers to, but also the overall 2030 agenda. So you should really consider the decade, and maybe we can actually go to the next slide. You should really consider the decade as an action framework. And in this action framework, we have identified the 10 most pressing challenges that we need to address, and that really require transformative and solution-based ocean science to achieve the ocean we want. And the ocean we want is summarized in those 7 societal outcomes. And this is a clean ocean, and healthy and resilient ocean, and so on. The decade, in a sense, will provide a common framework to achieve these outcomes through decade actions, which are either programs, projects, contributions, and activities that are put forward by a community of stakeholders to address these global challenges. And of course, climate change is a central element to all of these challenges. The challenges and the outcomes most relevant to the ocean climate nexus are highlighted in red on this slide. But we know that climate change touches on many aspects of life on Earth, which requires, of course, transformative and transdisciplinary solutions. We have a specific challenge number 5, which addresses the need to unlock ocean-based solutions to climate change. So this is a kind of a focus of our work. The Ocean Decade is positioned to play a unique role within the science policy interface to address climate change by providing the sound science to inform decision-making at both local, national, and global scales through the development of co-design and co-delivered science with all stakeholders. We also work across UN entities. This is a UN-wide initiative. We work with member states, with scientists, with communities, with the private sector and industry, with policymakers, but also, as I mentioned earlier, local and indigenous knowledge holders to deliver this science, which we hope we can get by the end of this decade, and before that, hopefully as well. Let's move to the next slide. So when we talk about ocean and climate nexus in the context of a decade, of course, Joanna Post will give us some fresh news on what happened in COP26. But I think there were a number of important wins to acknowledge, particularly for the ocean. I think, first of all, there's a bold recognition that, of the urgency of sound science for climate action and decision making. This was very much prominent in many events at COP, in the Blue Agenda, in the Ocean Action Day. I think the agreement to update NDCs in 2022 provides also an opportunity for stakeholders from around the world to basically advocate for ocean-based solutions in their respective NDCs and climate action plans processes. The special call for annual reporting on the ocean and annual ocean climate dialogue will also be an important opportunity for the Ocean Decade and for keeping track on the knowledge and the science we need to deliver on those important agendas. So the Ocean Decade action framework has also been structured to address a number of important knowledge gaps that we have in the ocean climate nexus. And in my next slide, I just want maybe to touch upon some of those. And maybe the first one to start with is really the need for enhanced ocean observations. We know that observations are fundamental to adequately incorporating the ocean as a regulator of climate for the inclusion of these essential ocean variables in climate models. And these variables include observations that are critical for monitoring ocean acidification, for example, deoxygenation and ocean warming, amongst a few. So we need to establish best practices also to ensure that we have those observations and they are coordinated globally, so we can get the big picture, but we can also have a more in-depth and higher resolution at more local and regional scales. And of course, all of this requires streamlined data management platforms and improved technology transfer. So that's number one. That's number two, I think, is, of course, we need to understand the physics and the physical drivers of climate and the geochemical responses. We are also severely lacking in our understanding to understand the cumulative impacts of these climate-induced stresses and how they are having an impact on the biology of the ecosystem. And so we need also to build our knowledge on multiple stresses of ecosystems, because we know that those are impacting the capacity of those ecosystems to deliver very important society services to society. The third, I think, priority area is certainly the deep ocean. We know that an overwhelming portion of the deep sea has not yet been explored. We need to better understand the climate services that the deep ocean provides through large-scale processes, which are impacting ocean circulation, but also the biology of the deep sea and mesopelagic areas that are also providing a much greater service than is currently understood. Then the next, I think, priority area is really the ocean climate nexus. And we know that this is very much a transdisciplinary topic, and we need to work with social scientists and communities directly to develop equitable adaptation strategies to those communities most vulnerable to climate change, and specifically the ones who are living in the low-lying coastal areas. So there are many facets that we need to better understand to ensure that this is done in the right way. And finally, I would say that we know that there is a vast potential in ocean and coastal blue carbon assets that will be far more efficient at carbon sequestration than some of the other efforts that are being considered. So we need greater focus on how to tap into these resources, and particularly how to implement the restoration and conservation of these assets so that they are most beneficial to the blue economy and climate mitigation. So let's move to the next slide. And here the message is really that the decade is already working and it's on its way. We have launched a first call for decade actions at the end of last year, and as a result, we have been able to endorse 31 international programs, 84 projects, and 10 UN decade actions that are basically supporting the transformative ocean science solution for climate change. The programs that you can see here on the screens have been designed by a number of stakeholders, and they are very much about exchanging ideas, identifying knowledge. They're about building and filling the resource gaps and fostering transdisciplinary research, as well as facilitating the formation of networks on some of those topics. These programs have met the criteria for endorsement of a decade that ensures that they will be co-designed and have a global reach. And we have examples that are addressing, for example, the need of South Pacific small island developing states. We also have programs that are focusing on best practices for collecting baseline observations of essential ocean variables, which we need for climate projections and so on. And we've lost the slide. If we could have, please, the slide back. Don't know. Yeah, okay, it's going back. Very good, thank you very much. And we also have programs that are seeking to mobilize resources for innovative ocean solutions to climate change, for example, through competitive grant programs. So let's then move to the next slide and maybe focus on what are the next priority areas for engagement. So whilst I've, of course, highlighted a number of programs that are working towards generating ocean science for climate actions, we also recognize that there are still many gaps that needs to be addressed, in particular with regards to this decade challenge. So our second call for decade actions, which is currently open now and which will end at the end of January, is actually also seeking submissions that will specifically focus on this ocean and climate nexus challenge, as well as on the challenge related to marine pollution and ecosystem resilience. The key message is also that the decade is really designed to leave no one behind, and we are striving to include small island developing states and these developing countries which are specifically encouraged to take part and submit decade actions in this call. And we will also be providing some technical support at the level of regions and in particular those beneficiaries to ensure that they can also come up with their solutions, with their ideas, and in a self-driven way. We are also developing, and with the coordination of a decade, which is led by the IOC Secretariat, we are assisting in the development of regional and national decade committees that will be able also to assist with the submission of decade actions. And these mechanisms are potentially very important to discussing knowledge needs and the integration of ocean issues into NDCs. We also have launched a global stakeholder, which provides a working environment for all the decade stakeholders working on the thematic areas, but also really about creating collaborations and cooperations between different themes and different type of stakeholders, whether they are science, whether they are decision makers, or the private sector, for example. The issue of finance and partnership is also very important. Clearly, the decade wants and is about creating an enabling environment for the development of those solutions and the new knowledge, and that requires investments. So in this context, we're very pleased that in the second call for decade actions, we've been able to also pin down some of the funding from the private sector and from governmental organizations, and we have, in this example, the AXA research, AXA being a global insurance company, and Mirvissen, an initiative led by the German Ministry of Cooperation, which are actually putting some resources to the table and basically soliciting proposals on coastal resilience and nature-based solutions in the context of this decade action call. The role of philanthropy is also very important, and it will be also critical to supplement the traditional funding cycles and requirements for research throughout the decade. And we also have a Decade Alliance, which will aim to bring some of those eminent partners and investors in ocean science to mobilize more support and also matchmaking in terms of what the decade actions require in terms of future support to achieve their objectives. So with this, Marie, I think I will stop here. This is just a brief overview of what we aim to do in the context of a decade. I invite you to look at the new decade website, which was launched a month ago, and also to join in through the Global Stakeholder Forum, which is now operational. So with this, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien. I really liked the idea of the Ocean Decade and the Leave No One Behind. I think it's a great idea that maybe GEO principals could adopt as a way to create their national adaptation plans, etc. So we're just going to go back to Ambassador Thompson, who has been able to join us. So just to reintroduce him, Ambassador Thompson is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, in which role he drives global support for UN Sustainable Development Goal 14 to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources. He served as President of the UN General Assembly from 2016 to 2017. Over to you, Ambassador Thompson.
Very good. Thank you very much. Two apologies. One for being late, not my style, but I did spend half an hour exploring the many rabbit holes which got me to this one eventually. Secondly, I believe there was some sort of introductory video played from me. I wasn't aware of that, so I apologize to those who are going to hear my words twice, and just go off and make a cup of tea or something if you don't want to go through that torture. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just prepared 10 minutes remarks here, so that's your tea time. First of all, it's such a great pleasure to be addressing GEO, and I regard it as an honor. And the reason I think it's an honor is that you all gathered together to envisage a future wherein decisions and actions for the benefit of humankind are informed by coordinated and comprehensive and sustained Earth observations. Because I have no doubt that through accurate accumulations of observations, we'll be able to fulfill the noble aspirations of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which Julien Barbier has just so clearly presented to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, we recently completed UNFCCC COP26, and I was present in Glasgow for the full 2 weeks of the COP, and I came away from it with mixed feelings. To put that remark into context, I'll summarize the content of a letter that I sent to the Right Honourable Alok Sharma a few months before he took on the presidency of COP26. The letter was dispatched the day after the UN Secretary General declared that the IPCC Climate Change Report 2021 was a code red for humanity, placing massive responsibilities on the deliberations and outcomes of COP26. In the letter, I affirmed that there can be no healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and that the global ocean community had long considered COP26 to be a critical opportunity to stop the accelerating decline of the ocean's health. To the letter, I attached summaries of the scientific advice I had received illustrating the perils of ocean acidification, advice received as a result of a broad outreach to relevant global authorities. I reported to Minister Sharma that it had been abundantly clear for some time now that the UNFCCC process needed a decision text that firmly recognized the intrinsic linking of the ocean and climate change, with a call for stronger action by parties. On behalf of the ocean community, I urged him, as COP26 President-designate, to exercise strong leadership on such text and provided him a summary of core issues. I'm happy to say that on this score, I was very satisfied with the outcomes of COP26 and believe that on the ocean climate nexus front, Minister Sharma and the government of the United Kingdom can claim a lasting legacy from COP26. Quote, "The integrity of all ecosystems, including the ocean," unquote, found its way into the decision text of the COP. And then in the body of the document, we find a welcome for the COP25 mandated ocean and climate dialogue to consider how to strengthen adaptation and mitigation action, and an invitation to the Substa Chair to hold an annual dialogue to strengthen ocean-based action and to prepare an informal summary report thereon, making it available thereafter to COP. We also find an invitation to relevant UNFCCC work programs and constituted bodies to consider how to integrate and strengthen ocean-based action in their existing mandates and work plans, and to report on these activities within the existing reporting processes. What all this means is that the climate-ocean nexus is finally inside the tent, whereas we have long been peering through the flaps at UNFCCC COPs, we are now an integral part of the UNFCCC processes. This is plainly as it should be in a world in which climate is the result of the interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean. But COP26 did not take us out of the code red for humanity territory. The last-minute watering down of language on the phase-out of coal was very disappointing for most of us, but especially for small island developing states like my own, that as a result must now continue to suffer the consequences of rising sea levels, escalating tropical storms, and the death of their coral reefs. In this regard, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the Glasgow Climate Pact was an important step, but plainly not enough. To keep alive the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, the Secretary General said it is time to go into emergency mode, to quote him, emergency mode, ending fossil fuel subsidies, phasing out coal, putting a price on carbon, protecting vulnerable communities, and delivering the $100 billion climate finance commitment. To quote him, he said, "We did not achieve these goals at this conference, but we have some building blocks for progress." So that progress now takes us in the direction of COP27 in Egypt, where countries are expected next year to report progress towards much greater climate ambition. In the meantime, the atmosphere and the ocean get hotter and hotter. Ladies and gentlemen, as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, it is crucial that we dedicate efforts on a global scale in defense of a healthy ocean. The ocean's health has been measurably in decline for some time now, and we, and I mean all of us, have been party to driving that decline. I ask you to pause in your deliberations today and thinking in terms of intergenerational justice and love for our children and grandchildren, consider how we're going to stop the decline. I believe the basic answer to that question is that we will henceforth have to govern our activities with a logical and ethical dedication to sustainability, along with a restoration of respect for and balance within the embrace of Mother Nature. To achieve that, we need to accept that linear exploitation of finite planetary resources is a dead-end street, and that we have reached a point on humanity's path whereupon global transformation to circular recycling systems of production and consumption has become a straightforward matter of survival or not. What more must we do? We will have to muster the necessary courage and grasp the nettle of international consensus that is so sorely required at international gatherings these days. Lest there remains doubt in anyone's mind, I repeat the fact that SDG 14's nemesis is humankind's continuing burning of fossil fuels. The massive scale at which we burn fossil fuels, creating the greenhouse gases, blanketing our atmosphere, are commensurately changing the composition of the ocean. The ocean has absorbed 90% of the heat from global temperature rises, so it should not be a surprise that immense changes are underway and that we now witness such phenomena as escalating marine heat waves and rising sea levels and the death of those coral reefs. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are, of course, many other reasons for the decline of the ocean's well-being, particularly harmful fishing practices and habitat destruction and rampant pollution. And these three travesties are being proactively addressed by widespread global community action from governments, science, academia, NGOs, philanthropies, and the agencies of the UN system. Insofar as they are included in their competencies, these three areas of detrimental human practice are a large part of preparations for the CBD COP in Kunming, the UN Food System Summit in New York, the outcomes thereof, the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA 5 in Nairobi in February, and of course the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon next year. It goes without saying that we should also be dedicated to the successful implementation of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development and the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And so, having established this interconnected web of international endeavor to do the right thing by people and planet, we must get to it, for we've got much work to accomplish. In that regard, under universal mandate from 193 member states of the United Nations, the second UN Ocean Conference will be co-hosted by the governments of Portugal and Kenya in Lisbon, 27 June to 1st July next year. When we arrive in Lisbon next year, we must be ready to put in place the science-based solutions necessary to stop the decline in the ocean's health. Ladies and gentlemen, as we voyage into the future made increasingly precarious by global warming, we begin to grasp the great importance of the emerging sustainable blue economy. Many believe that in the not too distant future, the sustainable blue economy will be the basis of human security. And as a loving grandfather, I count myself amongst them. At COP26 in Glasgow, I repeatedly called for movement of the climate finance needle in the direction of the sustainable blue economy. And I'm pleased to say there's evidence the needle is moving. We do not want millions or billions of dollars to flow into the sustainable blue economy. We want trillions of dollars. Why? Because we need those dollars to secure the health of the ocean and thereby the planet and thereby the well-being of our grandchildren. We need the trillions of dollars to decarbonize the global shipping fleet and the ports that service it, funding a transformation that's already begun, moving from powering our ships with the filth of bunker oil to pollution-free green hydrogen. We need the trillions because if we invest now in offshore energy, in wind, tidal, wave, and other ocean technologies, we will have all the renewable energy we need many times over to power sustainable ways of life on this planet. We need the trillions of dollars invested to feed the future through sustainable aquaculture and farming the ocean to produce new, sustainable, nutritious forms of future food, seaweeds, phytoplanktons, and other ethical, non-fed forms of aquaculture. We need the trillions for the scientific research of the ocean that will help us understand the currently unknown properties that, amongst so many other benefits, will secure our health in the post-antibiotic age. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I affirm that which you already know, namely that only through accurate and coordinated global observation will we obtain the science we need for the ocean we want. I wish you well for your plenary deliberations, and I thank you for your attention, and again, apologize for being late.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your inspirational words. I'm sure, like me, our GEO community are thinking deeply about what practical approaches we can take to develop our own national responses. The Canberra GEO Ministerial Declaration acknowledged the need for GEO community to support SIDS with their Earth observation needs in recognition of their heightened vulnerability to climate and disaster risks. We're very pleased the Pacific is actively engaged in the GEO community through initiatives such as Digital Earth Pacific. Just before we move to our next speaker, I'd just like to remind the audience that you can pop questions in the chat at any time for our speakers and in the Q&A portal for the session following the presentations. Our next speaker is Dr. Joanna Post. Joanna is a Program Management Officer for Research and Systematic Observation and leads the negotiations on this SBSTA agenda item and liaison with the science community. She also leads Secretariat support for strengthening ocean-related action and engagement. Over to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Marie. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Hello to my fellow panelists as well. We spent several hours together during COP pushing the ocean agenda, so it's very nice to be on the platform with you. Peter mentioned the outcomes from COP. This is very exciting, and I'm just going to provide a few more of the details from the Secretariat point of view and the way forward. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And as Peter quite rightly pointed out, and I think actually, the reflection on both Julian and Peter's talk so far is that it takes a community. We have a shared responsibility. It's a cyclical process. We're all working together to push stronger action on climate and on oceans. And this is reflected really here in this slide. We know that ocean is part of the climate system, it's a driver of the climate system, but it's been largely ignored under the policy process of the UNFCCC until very recently, and several colleagues have been working very strongly together since really Paris to push this agenda. From the science point of view, which is one of my other hats, there is a value chain approach to how science comes into the UNFCCC process through, of course, the very important work of the observation community, GEO being a part of that, the work of research, and then the IPCC plays a role in assessing peer-reviewed science and has a key role in providing that information at the minute through its AR6 report. And all of this information comes into this sort of black box, if you like, of the policy. And it works in two levels under the UNFCCC. There's the process part, that's how it all works, constituted bodies, negotiations, pushing the agenda. We are sort of a secretariat to catalyze information. And then, of course, the work of parties themselves, of governments within that context, and the work that they are doing on adaptation, on mitigation, on providing support for all of that. And as Peter quite rightly said, there's an urgent need for greater support for action by parties. And that are relevant for oceans and relevant for science. The ocean comes in a broad definition of the climate system, which is in the original Article 1.3. There are commitments under Article 4, and there is an Article 5, which is specifically on research and observation and supporting countries, and particularly developing country parties, strengthen their research and observation. The Paris Agreement, as many of you I'm sure know, has its overriding temperature goal, but there is also goals for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and importantly, the global stocktake. And I'll speak to more of those in a moment. But it is a cyclical process, as I said, because this information comes to parties, but then parties, through their decisions, taken most recently, of course, at COP, provide, the next steps and the ways forward for the community to act, both in the scientific context as well as the broader policy context. Next slide, please. So the Paris Agreement is the next slide. I won't go into too much detail, but again, talking of cyclical processes, it has started in 2020 officially. Its overriding goal is obviously to limit global temperatures to 1.5, to keep 1.5 alive, as came out of COP26, to foster resilience and low greenhouse gas development through adaptation, and to promote finance flows consistent with these low GHG emission development paths. Now, countries identify what they intend to do. They communicate what they intend to do through their nationally determined contributions. That work is then carried out through action. Parties report what they're doing through back to the Secretariat, and that information actually is changing now. It's I won't go into the details, but under the Paris Agreement, it'll be through an enhanced transparency framework and reports under that. The global Stocktake, which just also started at COP26, is an important role here, a ratchet mechanism of the Paris Agreement, which will ultimately lead to higher ambition in NDCs when they're revised in 2025. Next slide, please. I see the delay. Thank you. So ocean and ocean science. We know that ocean action is extremely important. I've just lost the slides, but I'll carry on. There needs to be more work, of course, from the scientific community in better understanding the value of what the ocean can give us. But also the ocean is a space where action can take place, both adaptation and mitigation. So the current science is mature enough for obviously identifying problems, but of course more is needed. And I won't repeat what Julian said, but we need to strengthen observation and science, and this is recognized under the UNFCCC's process. But we also need to identify options for moving forward to use the ocean space for parties to recognize that the ocean and climate is interlinked, not just in terms of impacts, but in terms of action and strengthening action moving forward. Next slide, please. So parties coming out of Madrid, actually, really the first step in getting us to this outcome from COP was an ocean and climate change dialogue, which took place virtually last year, was the mandate out of Madrid. It looked at how to strengthen ocean and climate action in terms of action in the process under the UNFCCC, in terms of the framing across the UN, and there's obviously more work to do. I work closely with UN Oceans colleagues to try and strengthen this understanding, as well as supporting countries. And we had a very popular side event from the UN Oceans looking at how the UN Oceans is supporting nations at the COP. There's the national level work, and of course 80% roughly of NDCs identify ocean action, both in terms of mitigation, blue carbon, and strengthening blue carbon, as well as adaptation. So there's a real need to not just strengthen, but support strengthening of action, and as part of national level work. And the finance, of course, climate finance, ocean finance is a phrase that's picking up more and more. And of course, the Ocean Dialogue last year recognized the importance of what we're doing now. We're missing the physical contact, but at least the virtual contact, we're dialoguing. And that is really important to strengthen this understanding and this need for action and look at ways forward. So next slide, please. And really this summarizes what Peter said in his presentation, but from the SBSTA, so the Scientific Body for Scientific Technological Advice, there's a lot of conversation there about research and systematic observation. There's Article 5 of the Convention, and we have an ongoing mandate to look at the needs there. Coming out of COP, there was an urgency for strengthening ocean observation, particularly in areas which have low observation at the minute, and we know that the ocean is one of those. As well as the cryosphere in parts. There's a push for understanding the challenges and opportunities for nature-based solutions from the scientific community. And actually the valuable work of GEO was recognized in the outcomes of SBSTA as well, particularly in terms of partnership and collaboration. The Glasgow Climate Pact is I won't repeat what Peter said, but of course, moving forward, what we want to do is really try and find a way to strengthen ocean action across the board at the UNFCCC, and I'll be working closely with colleagues on that, the constituted bodies who are advising on adaptation, on loss and damage, and so on, as well as holding now this regular dialogue. And we need to look at how we do that effectively to push the agenda forward, as well as bring in colleagues that can really strengthen this government action, link with our colleagues in the UN Decade as well, really strongly as well in that respect. And then that dialogue will be annual. It'll be at the first session every year, which will be in the June session. And then we'll provide a report back to the subsequent COP every year. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. But one thing I think it's worth also mentioning is the global stocktake. This is as I said, the ratchet mechanism of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is in Article 14, 3 very short paragraphs. I've summarized them here, but it's looking at collective progress under the Paris Agreement and the goals. And the ocean is a very important part of that, not just from the scientific perspective, but also from the action in terms of mitigation, whether that be reducing emissions, blue carbon, fisheries, and support for food, changing in food systems, and as well as the adaptation. So that the GST, the global stocktake, looks at different themes: mitigation, adaptation, finance flows, as well as loss and damage, and as well as looking at the underlying scientific support for that, where we are and where we really need to go to push the agenda. And this is a process that has, at the minute, an information collection phase. So countries in the decision itself, I recommend everyone to read it, but there's also a web page which has the information, really trying to collect information at the moment. We'll have a series of technical dialogues starting next year, which will look at where we are in terms of what the NDCs are saying, what is happening in terms of action and at an aggregated level in terms of adaptation and mitigation and finance flows. And then at the end of 23, we'll push for a higher ambition. So that global stocktake is an important part of the work as well. The slides keep fading in and out, but I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to strengthening unity moving forward, as well as obviously in other areas of observation work that they're doing to support the convention. And thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanna. And apologies to everyone. The slides do keep crashing in the system, so I do apologise for that. It's also great to see how many activities in the GEO work program support ocean health, and in doing so, the Paris Agreement. Most notably, GEO Blue Planet and wetlands activities directly support the mitigation objective within the Paris Climate Agreement. So on to our next presenter, who is Rosamond Bing. Rosamond is the Chief Executive Officer for the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources for the Government of the Kingdom of Tonga. She has held senior executive positions and acted as in-house legal counsel for the ministry for over 20 years. She's the representative of the Government of Tonga to GEO, having secured membership for the Kingdom in 2019. Over to you, Rosamond. No, Rosamond, we can't hear you.
The Kingdom of Tonga, a country with over 3,000 years of history, is positioned at the southernmost group in the Polynesian Islands. Because of its position in the South Pacific and its low-lying geography, Tonga is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, ranking second of 181 countries on the World Disaster Risk Index in 2020. Earthquakes, tsunamis, floods and cyclones are a constant threat in Tonga, and with climate change, cyclones and flooding are becoming less predictable and more intense. In 2020, the Government of Tonga and ADB commissioned a multi-hazard climate and disaster risk assessment covering the island of Tongatapu in order to identify both high and low risk areas and communities.
And this study providing the opportunity of this important assessment of where we are, the situations, and giving us some solid scientific evidence of these impacts of climate change. A database was developed, of course, to quantify and distribution and characteristics of assets and population across the island.
Based on international, regional, national datasets and field observation, the assessment analyzed 28,000 buildings, 1,200 kilometers of roads, 26,000 power and 500 water assets across the entire island, including the capital. These assets were plotted against earthquakes, windstorms, tsunamis, rain-fed, and coastal flooding hazards to model the impact of natural hazards with and without climate change. The assessment finalized in May 2021 identified climate and disaster risks to assets and population across Tongatapu expressed as annual average losses.
Tongatapu is the most densely populated area of Tongatapu, and it's situated between two bodies of water. It's also the 5th lowest lying city in the world at only 1.5 meters above sea level. When you combine these factors, plus underlying poor drainage and continual development, it is very important for us to understand how to manage low-risk planning for the future.
The assessment applied various climate change scenarios, namely sea level rise and extreme rainfall events, against different levels and likelihoods of flooding. Results were broken down at the level of individual towns, which are the basic administrative units in Tonga. A risk index was established ranking these towns against individual and combined hazard threats. And this way, the assessment gained an understanding of areas in Tongatapu that will be at high risk from climate change and subject to frequent or even permanent flooding. The assessment also identifies relatively safe areas on the island for future investments and adaptation. As Asia and the Pacific's climate bank, ADB is bringing new ideas and technologies to make meaningful action against the threat of climate change.
The Multi-Hazard Risk Assessment Report is of great value to Tonga. By helping us plan with low risk, we can ensure the long-term security of our assets and the safety of our populations. By identifying the high risk, we are able to look at a new way as to when and where to locate our future assets so that we can ensure that we plan for the sustainable development and future growth of the Kingdom of Tonga.
The information allows to design the gradual development of safer areas and steering investments away from the highest risk areas while ensuring that all investments are designed and operated to withstand multiple hazards. And this includes using post-disaster situations and recovery to not only build back better in a manner resilient to natural hazards, but to promote rebuilding away from high-risk locations for a safer and resilient Tonga in the 21st century.
Still can't hear you, Rosamond. No, still nothing.
Is she? Yeah, okay.
Still don't have any sound.
Come back.
All right, I think we might move on to our next speaker while we try and sort out Rosamond's audio, because I think I'd really like to hear what she's got to say. So we might move on. Yeah, okay, right, we might move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Laura David. So Dr. David is a professor of oceanography. She makes use of remote sensing and modelling to explore how ocean physics influences the distribution and state of ocean flora and fauna. She is recognised as one of the country's pioneers in ocean remote sensing, with her expertise being tapped to assist in matters related to climate change, vulnerability and adaptation. She is currently the chair of the Philippine Commission of Higher Education Technical Committee on Marine Science and the director of the UP Marine Science Institute. She is also a scientific steering committee member of the GEO Blue Planet and Academy member of Future Earth Coasts. Over to you, Laura.
Hello, good morning, good evening to all of you. We can go on to the next slide, please. So GEO Blue Planet Next slide, please. GEO Blue Planet is a GEO initiative that brings together ocean and coastal observers, social scientists, and end user representatives from a variety of stakeholder groups. The aim being to get knowledge contributions from all of these to ensure the sustained development and use of ocean and coastal observations for the benefit of society. It has 3 standing working groups that implement cross-cutting activities: Stakeholder Engagement and Societal Awareness Working Group, Capacity Development Working Group, and Data Discovery, Access, and Utilization Working Group. In the next slide, you'll see the core actions associated with each working group. GEO Blue Planet's mission is to advance and exploit synergies among the many observational programs devoted to ocean and coastal waters. It also aims to improve engagement with a variety of stakeholders for enhancing the timeliness, quality, and range of services delivered, and also to raise awareness of the societal benefits of ocean observations at the public and policy levels. GEO Blue Planet activities are organized around 10 thematic areas, as we will see in the next slide. These themes could potentially support national plans related to climate adaptation. So the 10 themes are climate, disaster warning and mitigation, sustainable coast, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, marine biodiversity and ecosystems, ocean and human health, maritime safety, water quality, transportation, and ocean resources. The UNFCCC Synthesis Report on Intended Nationally Determined Contributions identified 13 key climate hazards that should be addressed for adaptation. Several of these hazards require ocean and coastal observations for adaptation planning, including sea level rise, ocean acidification, coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion. Given that the national adaptation plan should be regularly updated, there is room to engage at national level to explore, propose, co-create a package of Earth observation data and information that will help these countries. Coastal inundation, for example, is an area where Earth observations is prime for this, as we will see in the next slide. Specifically for archipelagic countries such as mine, the Philippines, and other island countries, as we saw in the Kingdom of Tonga, the theme of sustainable coast, one of the themes of GEO Blue Planet, is of particular interest. Data on rates of sea level rise, possible intensity of coastal storms, trajectory of tsunamis, and signs and rate of coastal erosion can help coastal communities make more informed decisions, and can also make urban development in coastal areas more sustainable. This is one of the national adaptation plans that can be addressed by GEO Blue Planet, but there are more, as seen in the next slide. So we see here that I'm using my country's framework for adaptation as an example, where we identified several topics that we think should should be highlighted in our NAP, such as food security, water sufficiency, ecological and environmental stability, human security, climate smart industry and services, and sustainable energy. The plan is that GEO Blue Planet is to work with countries like mine, a few countries, to identify priority topics of interest, and then work with those countries and experts to put together a technical guidance documents for incorporating ocean and coastal observations into national adaptation plans. We see on the ground that national adaptation plans need to organize actions that demand for sustainable development. Next slide, please. And if we map out the themes that I showed earlier with some of the NAP issues that we identified, for example, in my country, we see that there are specific NAP that can actually be addressed by specific GEO Blue themes and the corresponding ocean observation information that's needed. For example, in food security, the GEO Blue Planet theme of sustainable fisheries and aquaculture is perfect for this, no, to help this. Ocean observations such as the presence of toxic algae, tracking of illegal fishing activities, monitoring of the environment that support fisheries, monitoring of the environmental pressures on culture, for example, such as sea surface temperature, pollution, and habitat degradation are of great use. Another example is the ecological and environmental stability as a NAP issue in my country and in a lot of other countries. And here, the GEO Blue Planet theme of marine biodiversity and ecosystems, again, will be of much use to our countries. Ocean observations like monitoring of pressures on marine ecosystems, such as land use, fishing activities, direct and proxy ocean observations that monitor biodiversity and measure species distribution and density. So as we can see, there are a lot of intersections of the themes of GEO Blue Planet and the needs of the nations in order to adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. On the ground, we've seen that NAPs will be sustainable only if we address two things. One is we have to have robust community ownership for climate actions, which means that the data that should be provided to these communities are at resolutions relevant to community scale. Unfortunately, for most highly vulnerable countries, such as the Philippines, forecast data are not available at resolutions that can be used by coastal communities. In lieu of these, we can instead look at historical long-term data from Earth observations and treat these as a conservative scenario. Seen here, for example, in this slide, is an example of how we did this to determine the trends of sea surface temperature, sea surface height, and precipitation. And we overlaid this on coastal habitats and made use of this to guide us on areas where climate change will most likely affect these coastal habitats. No? So going forward, adaptations such as protection, reforestation of mangroves, and so on are guided by these data. Next slide, please. At the same time, we see that countries such as ours there's a possibility of leveraging opportunities based on our comparative advantage, such as our biodiversity, and make use of these for nature-based solutions. We see here, for example, areas with significant coastal resources fared better, such as coastal communities with thick mangrove forests, when there were storms that went through this area. This particular picture is the community of Palompon, wherein a mangrove plantation located on the northeast side of the island actually protected and buffered the full impact of the 3.6-meter storm surge. In some instances, nature-based solutions are also mitigation measures, such as blue carbon. Since activities in coastal wetlands lead to an increase in carbon sink, these changes should be included in the national greenhouse gas inventories. But many countries do not have the capacity to estimate the extent of their blue carbon ecosystems, so they are unable to assess their importance. I was told, for example, in Mexico, the blue carbon ecosystems are already included in the adaptation component of the nationally determined contributions, but these are not yet included in the greenhouse gas inventories due to lack of information required for the calculation of mangrove extensions and seagrass and salt marshes. So this is another avenue where GEO Blue Planet can be of much help. Next slide, please. So in summary, GEO Blue Planet is interested in working with pilot countries to develop technical guidance on using ocean and coastal observations in NAPs. We are also interested in supporting the UN Decade of the Ocean Science to support the Ocean Climate Nexus and have relevance to Earth observations. And finally, GEO Blue Planet is interested in blue carbon and nature-based solutions as well. Next slide, please. Let me take this opportunity to invite everyone to an event tomorrow, focusing on developing cooperation across GEO activities to address marine hazards in Africa. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciated that, and seeing the NAP issues mapped to the Blue Planet themes, and therefore how the Earth observation can help meet those challenges. That was really useful to me, so thank you very much. We might try to go back to Rosamond now and see if her audio is working.
Thank you, Marie. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, yes, I see something. I see the green appearing there. Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank the previous speakers for setting the scene, and thank you, Marie, for facilitating this this session. I think it was probably best that I ended up being the last speaker, given that I've been asked to speak about regional responses and national responses. So what you saw in the video earlier was a literally fresh off the press video that was launched in at COP26, which is a partnership between the government of Tonga and ADB. And it is a short video with a brief summary on a multi-hazard risk assessment report that covers a number of hazards and a risk assessment of where our assets and our populations are most at risk. And I think many of the speakers spoke earlier about where we, in the climate and in ocean space, where I think some key issues are partnerships, capacity building, and very much science and evidence-based information and decision-making. So this report is literally fresh off the press as well, where Tonga is looking towards this report, and the next steps is to use this report to feed into another national initiative, which is to look at a climate change long-term strategy and pathway, and looking at options for adaptation. Coastal inundation, of course, and cyclones and tsunamis were three of the hazards that were also considered under this report. So it's very much in line with the activities, the responses, and where countries are looking at how to best use science partnerships in terms of where we're looking to adaptation measures in the immediate and in the long term. Having said that, at the regional level as well, other initiatives have been initiated, and I would like to talk about something that Marie had referred to earlier, which is the Digital Earth Pacific initiative, which the South Pacific Community, Secretariat for the South Pacific Community, SPC, is working together with the Pacific Island governments in support of our Samoa pathway, our Pacific Blue Continent strategy, and also supporting some of the broader projects at the regional level, such as the Climate and Ocean Support Program, to look at a tool that the Pacific and the region could use in a cost-effective manner. So what we have in place now is a community activity within the GEO work program. The SPC has asked that I be part of this initiative, first because Tonga is now a member of GEO, and we are encouraging our colleagues within the Pacific to join GEO as a member. So where we're looking at in terms of Digital Earth Pacific is to make freely available satellite data that's been collected over the past 3 decades to process this information, combine it, and to provide some key decision-ready products to address what the Pacific Island countries and territories have expressed to our steering committee and our technical assistants, other development challenges in this area. We are looking at covering all of the Pacific countries and territories with a cost-effective, when I say cost-effective, that usually means free, that can be accessible by all, with the intention that it be updated, operational at all times, and that it meets the specific needs and challenges from the Pacific Island countries. So what we have started the project with was a national consultation from each of the regions, Vanuatu from Melanesia, RMI from Micronesia, and Tonga from Polynesia. And we had national consultations with key stakeholders, such as agriculture, the statistics department, national disaster and emergency officers, and all other stakeholders, and asked for their input on what the development challenges were and how would they see Earth observation data assisting to addressing those challenges. So we have just released a Earth observation needs assessment, and that's online, and I'll provide the link to that. And some of the main priorities expressed during these national consultations included cyclone and inundation impacts, amongst other land-based challenges. So we are looking at providing decision makers with information from the historical information, current information, so that we're in a position to be able to plan and to invest what is becoming very limited resources, and we're competing for resources and financing in, especially as Ambassador Thompson referred to earlier, COVID has added on another major shock for the Pacific Island region. So resourcing is becoming very much a critical issue for us. So we're hoping that Digital Earth Pacific will provide a cost-effective and a tool where we could collaborate, cooperate, and in cooperation with the region as a whole, be able to have a tool where we can contribute to the decision-making given the critical situation we're currently facing. We have a Digital Earth Steering Group with country representation in partnership with GEO, with Geoscience Australia, with NOAA and NIWA, and many of our partners that we've worked together in the past. And through a private and public partnership strategic approach, we have been able to attract Microsoft to assist in the development of the Digital Earth Pacific. And this is a very important milestone for the work that we've started. We're looking very much towards a prototype by the end of this year to be able to deliver that to our partners, build a business case, and should we be successful, hopefully we'll engage our GEO partners. This is just an example from my side of what Tonga is doing at the national level, and an initiative at the regional level that we look very much forward to our GEO partners joining us in this collaborative effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosamond. I really enjoyed your video, and the video and your remarks really highlight the urgent need of the Pacific and other SIDS for high quality Earth observation data that we can immediately use to mitigate and manage the threats associated with climate change. So thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll now move on to the question and answer session. We've had one question popped into the chat, so we'll start with that one. So Julian, over to you. The CEOS Space Agencies has initiated a coastal initiative contributing to Ocean Decade. Given that the space agencies have limited resources, which ocean climate thematic areas should CEOS focus on? GST, NAP, or even plastic? Julian, I don't have your audio.
I can speak to some of that if Julian's not available.
Yes, please do. Thanks, Joanna.
In terms of in CEOS, sort of then at a more spatially aggregate countries. Of course, there's in terms of that we do not deal directly with that, but there is, of course, a big interaction with the work with plastics, and I think that's a conversation that will definitely increase moving forward, as well as the work under the UN, whether there will be a intergovernmental sort of action on plastic. Or all is a short answer to that question.
Thank you, Joanna. Actually, Laura, from a Blue Planet perspective, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
In terms of prioritization of which one?
Yes.
Is that the question? I would, I guess all of them are important, but from the GEO Blue Planet perspective, the ones that will most benefit, I guess, the highly vulnerable areas would be our priority. So that being said, well, I guess that basically that's the answer.
Great, thank you, Laura. I have a question actually for Joanna. As Ambassador Thompson noted, the ocean climate issues are tightly linked. So going forward, what value do you see in the ocean and climate communities collaborating closely? And if you see value in that, how can we best achieve it?
That is a very good question. There's lots of levels in which that question can be answered, to be honest with you. Of course, we work closely across the UN system at the UN Oceans level, but that in itself could be strengthened through a stronger framework of action around ocean and climate across the UN. But of course, we have a mandate within the UN Oceans to work closely together. And as I mentioned, dialogue is really important at that context. At a more national level, now that we have this recognition from the outcomes from COP26 of this of ocean and climate as a consideration that needs to be considered together, then of course countries, governments must pick up this idea that the different ministries need to speak to each other. Colleagues perhaps in SIDS are much more aware of these issues that are so tied together than in other countries. So there's an urgency there, and this is something that the UN Oceans have aired also during COP of the support at the national level, so that the work that's done, I mean, it's not considered as ocean and climate, but it's, that's not how governments approach their work. So, but at the same time, governments are looking at, what can be done to respond to the Paris Agreement, what can be done to respond to the biodiversity. And I think recognizing this at the intergovernmental level is a first step. And of course, the work of GEO is extremely important in bringing these conversations together from the scientific community to support this action and having a strong scientific base from which to go forward on ocean and climate. Of course, we'll strengthen this work, and we will be working closely together on that. So it's from all levels, and also within the context.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Appreciate that. We've got some connection issues. So do you have one more question in the chat box? Just first, I might go to Julian. I think we've got you back now. So question for you, what synergies do you see existing between the priorities of the Ocean Decade and Ambassador Thompson's 10 ocean climate challenges? And in particular, in your view, where should the GEO community focus its attention?
Thank you. Can you hear me, Mary?
Yes, I can. Okay,
sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened. I think there's a lot of synergies and alignment there. I mean, certainly, the decade priorities, the challenges have been, first of all, defined through a large consensual process that include both the science community, but also the policy community, the other UN systems, and with also the ambition to really deliver not only knowledge, but also solutions to address some of the ocean sustainability aspects that are covered in SDG 14, whether we're talking about, better managing and mitigating ocean pollution, protecting key ecosystems. But I think one very important element is that we want to address in the decades, and this is also an issue that many countries are facing, and this is really the availability and the access to data and information to really come up with the tools and the methods to forecast for example, the marine weather extremes that we're talking about, but also to understand the adaptive capacities of ecosystems, such as mangroves and coral reefs to climate change. So I think from that side, there's there are probably two challenges. One of them is that there's a lack of data on many ocean variables, and with some part of the ocean where we have very sparse data available there, and some parts where we don't have enough granularity to actually use the data and the information to support the management at the different scales. And I think there's also somehow an imbalance in the ones who have a capacity and the ones who don't have a capacity. So, as part of a decade, and I think what Peter Thompson was saying is really we need to develop the ability to provide relevant information at both the regional, the global, and the local scale to address those local needs and adaptation. I mean, we have maybe one example of that in the decade. We have a global program called the Digital Twin of the Ocean, and it is really about releasing the data and about integrating those data sets also, which is also a very important element. But that needs to also link to the regional efforts that Rosamund was highlighting in the Pacific in terms of building a regional Earth observation data infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of potential and collaborations, within the regions, but also across the regions. And the decade can provide that bridge between the different type of partners, but also hopefully the institutions that can provide support to develop these approaches.
Great, thank you, Gillian. That's a really fantastic answer. Thank you very much. So we'll go to the question that's come through the chat. So this one's for you, Laura. The ocean is a very large sink of CO2, but we still have large uncertainties in the strength and variability of this sink. How can we improve this with Earth observations, including in situ observations?
That's a good question. We can do a lot of estimates using primary productivity as one of the handles, no, in looking at the possible carbon sequestration from phytoplankton, for example. And that has been done previously, but there is a lack of actual in situ data in a lot of areas of the world, including the Philippines or the Western Pacific, to actually validate, calibrate those models. Aside from that, if you go near the coastal habitats, right now, mangrove data, the expanse of mangrove, the location, and so on, those are available. But wetlands and in my case, seagrass meadows are also not as highly documented, both because of interest. As a society, usually we look for our food from the coral reefs and the mangrove area and not much on the seagrass, but also because of lack in terms of technology. It's very hard still to do remote observation of seagrass extent. Seaweed meadows as well. So that's another avenue where Earth observations, higher resolution Earth observations, I guess, and more modeling with in situ data will benefit society and allow us to calculate better the carbon sequestration potential of the oceans.
Great, thanks, Laura. Sounds like there's still a fair bit of work to be done, and I guess that means we can look at with the GEO work program as well. Tosta, are you happy that we've answered your question sufficiently?
No, thank you very much for giving me the floor here. Yeah, so my name is Tosta Tano. I'm the co-chair of the Global Ocean Observing System, and we're working together then with Laura and the GEO Blue Planet on these issues. And I would like to just state that even though the blue carbon is a big sink of carbon and potential, as part of the solution, it's really the open ocean uptake of carbon that is the big driver here in the climate. The ocean is taking up right now about a quarter of all the fossil fuel emissions, and that is really the open ocean part of that. So it's a sink that is so large that we cannot ignore that in the climate negotiations and in our ability to assess the effectiveness of mitigation efforts. So right now we have an uncertainty of that carbon sink that is in the order of 20 to 30% on the annual scale. And we are talking now on the sink on 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide on annual scale in the open ocean. So I think we should try to think about how we can address that big question of the open ocean sink, not to put the blue carbon, the coastal carbon aside at all. Is very important, but the numbers are really not adding up to that large sink. So putting that back as a question, how can we work together in a more efficient way to address that open ocean sink of carbon? Thank you.
Thank you, Tosta. Really great to hear from you. And certainly working together is something that we're really keen to do. And as we look at our work program for GEO in the coming years, those items that you mentioned are certainly something that we need to consider how we might tackle that from an Earth observations perspective. So thank you very much for your input. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So the first one's for you, Rosamond. It was great to hear you outline what's happening with Digital Earth Pacific. How much were you able to learn and repurpose from other Digital Earth programs such as Digital Earth Australia and Digital Earth Africa from the GEO Work program?
Thank you very much for that question. It's quite obvious that we're looking at the principles and the platforms upon which Digital Earth Australia and Digital Earth Africa is based on. But we are customizing those programs to be suitable and fit for purpose for the Pacific region. And that's why we took the approach of having national consultations with selected countries to be able to gauge what the challenges were, what they thought would be the best options to address those challenges, and then try to meet their needs through the tools that we're currently developing. So very much, I think, based on same principles, same platforms, but customizing very much to what the Pacific region needs are. So work in progress, and we're looking forward very much to the outcome of the work that we're putting together.
Thank you, Rosamond. Yes, and obviously being involved in Digital Earth Australia, we can certainly see that there are some significant differences between the challenges that we are facing as a very dry continent compared to the Pacific Islands, which obviously have a vastly different problem set and scale. So, really looking forward to continuing to work with Digital Earth Pacific on their way forward as well.
Very good.
All right, one more question from the question and answer pages. So how do we make initiatives more accessible at a citizen level? How do we address people who are not necessarily trained or aware of climate ocean-induced risks? So I might go to you, Julian, first with this one.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, that's a critical question. I mean, science is not just for scientists; it's for decision making, but it's also about changing our whole behavior and interrelationship with the ocean. So for that, we need to socialize science. We need to build capacities. We need, I think, education. We need to build this concept of ocean and climate literacy, so that we don't only have citizens that are understand the role of the ocean in the climate system. They understand their role in vis-a-vis those two important bodies. But we need to work also with decision makers and the private sector in also creating the level of awareness and education. We do have an ocean literacy program in the decade, which is trying to tap on or approach each of those aspects. But that requires a lot of work, because for each of those topics, you really need to develop different strategies and modalities of engaging the public, engaging citizens. We talk a lot about citizen science, but at the end of the day, there are other ways to do that. There's a program also in the decade called the Decade of Ocean Empathy, and that's really trying to trigger the emotional side of people when it comes to their relationship to the marine environment and so on. So I think education, ocean literacy is essential. In all the work that we are doing, and I would encourage all of our programs to invest in those areas and have a minimum of at least 10 to 20% that is used for scientific outreach, for ocean literacy and communication.
Thank you, Julian. Rosamond, I might ask you the same question. In your experiences, how can you engage citizens in what is quite a complex science problem?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. I think one of the comments that I should have made earlier when I was talking about the multi-hazard risk assessment report is tailoring that report that consists of while science and evidence-based information is very useful, it has to be tailored and it has to be presented to communities in a manner that they're able to absorb and that they're able to respond to. So that's our next biggest challenge, is to develop a communication strategy for this particular report. So the video was the first attempt at presenting it in a visual manner. But it is very much critical that we're able to provide information and data to different stakeholders, because we're going to expect different engagement, different commentaries, different interests coming. So from each of these stakeholders. So that's actually quite critical. And I was just thinking earlier about with our Climate and Ocean Support Program, which a regional project, one of the initiatives and activities that we've completed there is the traditional knowledge. And it was a part of the traditional knowledge activity was a proposal from the stakeholders that we do need to be able to be in a position to listen to what the traditional knowledge is and to share the information that we have and the advice and technical assistance in a manner that aligns with traditional knowledge to some extent, but also that we're able to use the traditional knowledge in the way in which we provide services and deliver products to our communities. Because at the end of the day, this is about the safety and the security of the people on a day-to-day basis. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Rosamond. Yeah, certainly that engaging the citizen is an ongoing and challenging process, shall we say. Right, so I've got one last question for each panel member. What I'd really like to get out, one of the outcomes of the session today is around some recommendations to the GEO principals to take back to their own countries. So from each of you, I'd love to hear one recommendation from you that our principals can take back to their own countries, noting that our GEO principals are representing their Earth observation community in the country. So we want to be able to take something back that they can really be proactive with their marine and oceans representatives in their own nation. So I might start with you, Joanna. I can't hear you, Joanna, sorry.
Putting me on the spot.
Sorry.
I didn't unmute myself to think for a bit longer. Colleagues, observation is the foundation of the everything that we know about climate change and everything we know about the ocean. And I think that would be a clear thing to hold in your souls, really, going back. So your work is invaluable, but your work is invaluable if it's communicated to support action moving forward. So we are really changing the paradigm. When we got to the Paris Agreement, science wasn't just for informing people about what's going on, but solutions. So I urge you to really go back and look at how that information can be used across the board on climate, on oceans, to bring information that's really supporting solutions, to understanding the ocean, but also to use it as a solution space, because we are really needing this to move towards net zero, towards resilient climate, and for, as Rosamond quite rightly said, for every single citizen. So I leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Sorry to put you on the spot. So I'll move on to you, Julie.
Thank you. So without surprise, my recommendation would be engage in the decade, propose programs that can create collaboration across some of the issues we've discussed today. I think there's a great need to break down, particularly the spatial observations into information that really works at the scale of ocean management. Whether you are working in a local context in trying to understand where you should locate your marine protected areas, whether you are in charge of developing a marine spatial plan that will require a whole suite of data and information to inform the development and the adaptation of the plans in the future, or whether you're working at the regional level in terms of supporting regional governance for ocean management, that will also require a whole set of products and information products that should be really tailored to the need of these end users. So to get to those end users, you can certainly use the decade because we're trying to bring all these people to the table to develop those actions in a very in a really co-designed and co-delivered way.
Thank you, Julian. As someone who looks after both Earth observation and marine, they are still quite separate functions, even within my own team. So it's certainly a challenge that we have, I imagine, across many countries in trying to bring those two communities together, understanding how we can work. So thank you very much. Laura.
Yes. The reason I didn't become a medical doctor is because I said I didn't want anything to do with something that would affect a human life. So I went into Earth observation instead. But that's not true anymore, right? The science that we do, it really affects communities, it affects people. And we should really be proud of that, and at the same time, don't let ourselves get burnt out because there's a lot of work that we still have to do. And instead take that extra mile to really communicate the science that we do. I placed in the chat that we have to actually make use of the natural connectivity of the Gen Z. This generation is naturally connected, not just because of the pandemic right now, but because of all the social media resources. So we should take the effort to actually populate that so that they get the correct information and make use of that in their everyday decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura, and I thoroughly agree. Thanks very much. And finally, over to you, Rosamond.
Thank you, Marie. I think I have no choice but to commit the Digital Earth Pacific initiative, not only at the country level, but also because of some of the commitments we've made with the Pacific Geospatial and Survey Council, which is a collaboration amongst Pacific countries and territories, and also the work within the region. So if this could be a tool that will advance informed decision and helping our communities, and that this has to be a positive initiative. So that's where I would recommend further collaboration within the region, and also with the partnerships that we have with our GEO networks. So if I do reach out, then I hope I will get a positive response from all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosamond. And I know certainly from our perspective here at Geoscience Australia, we are keen to continue to work with you and the rest of the Pacific in these initiatives. All right, so I think we have run out of questions in the chat and the Q&A session. So I'm going to wrap up the session there. I'd like to firstly thank all of our panel members, Ambassador Thompson, Julian Barbera, Rosamond Bing, Laura David, and Joanna Post. Thank you all so very much for your presentations today. There's a lot in them, and certainly, we've learned that between COP26 and the United Nations Decade on Ocean Science, it's really clear that now's the time for action on climate and ocean issues. We've got a real opportunity through our GEO community to mitigate and adapt to the challenges faced by climate change. And certainly we must all keep climate and ocean issues in the front of our minds as a GEO community, particularly as we undertake our next round of activity planning. In doing that, that will help protect us all, and most importantly, our most vulnerable ocean-based states. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We've had a great participation. Thank you for your questions and comments in the chat. We've really appreciated engaging with you, and we hope to see you at the next session. Thank you very much.